we have Dr. Grubbs here as our specialist. And speaking of pathogens, I guess to circle back to that, what can we do to try and prevent, I guess, more pathogens from coming in?
Yeah, so spring and fall, which we think of as transition seasons in turf, these are critical seasons as it relates to disease scouting and disease development and prevention in turf grass systems. So let's touch on this a little bit. So in turfgrass lawns throughout the state of Texas, I would say we have two diseases that are going to be the most common, the most prevalent in a lot of our turfgrass lawns. The first of which is going to be large patch disease, which is Rhizoctonia solani. Now, a lot of people may know this by a different common name, which is brown patch disease. For a really long time, that was the correct name, and basically that name has shifted over the last several years as they've determined that there are actually slightly different anastomosis groups for Rhizoctonia, and I know that's a big word and we don't have to get into that, but basically what it means is we have a Rhizoctonia that targets cool season turf like tall fescue and things like that. So if you're up in the Panhandle or North Texas, you may have some experiences with that. And then we have some Rhizoctonia that targets warm season turf, which is a lot of what we have throughout the rest of the state of Texas. It includes Bermuda, St. Augustine, and zoysia grass. And so that particular disease, large patch, we're typically going to see come on and become more active in the fall as our soil temperatures drop to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit for several days. And then it'll continue to stay active. I would say most active typically when we're in about the 50 to 70 degree range soil temperatures throughout the fall, winter, and into the early spring. So what you will see as we begin to warm up and as our grass begins to green back up is you're going to see the symptoms of damage from that disease activity that's been going on since the fall if it's been present on your lawn. That disease in particular, we can see it in just about any of our warm season species, but you may experience more challenges with it in specifically zoysia grass and St. Augustine grass lawns. So one thing to be mindful of is as you see those symptoms appear in the spring, I don't think a fungicide application is going to hurt anything, but typically fungicides are going to be the most effective when they're applied preventatively for that disease in the fall. A lot of times by the time the symptoms are visible to us and our temperatures have increased enough for our grass to green up, the disease is not nearly as active, and so it may not be as responsive to fungicide products. And so anytime we see those symptoms there, we see, and we'll talk about this briefly because I know we're going to have some good pictures here. So symptoms of large patch, we're going to see these large circular shaped patches. Usually they'll have some nice rounded edges. They can range anywhere from a foot to several feet in diameter depending on the extent of the disease. As our turf greens up, we may notice that on the outer perimeter of those patches we'll have kind of a golden or orangey ring, and that's the turf that's being newly affected by the disease as it spreads outward. And so those will be kind of the distinctive symptoms up front, or from a distance. And then as we get up close, other things that we may see is we may see lesions on the lower crown or base of the turf grass plant. You'll be able to separate the shoots easily from the leaf sheaths. That's a diagnostic tool for that disease. And so of course, if you don't know what you're seeing and you're not sure, you can always submit a sample to the disease diagnostic lab and they'll help you confirm that that's what you're experiencing. So one thing that we want to do to try not to exacerbate that disease, particularly while we're still kind of transitioning from winter into spring, is we don't want to apply nitrogen too early in the season. So again, like we said earlier, apply your first nitrogen application really once you've had to mow your turf grass, not your weeds, but your turf grass at least twice for the year. So for a lot of us, that won't be until April or May, typically, depending on where we are in the state. We want to avoid putting those products out when our turf is still dormant or when our turf is not actively growing, because that nitrogen is not going to be utilized by our turf, which means something else is going to use it, whether it's some summer annuals that are coming up, weeds that we don't want, or disease like Rhizoctonia. So that's one thing that we want to be mindful of. The other thing that we want to be mindful of is that this disease is very responsive to moisture. We don't always have control over rainfall or things like that, obviously, but we also want to make sure that we are not irrigating at the wrong time. So some people continue to irrigate their turf through the winter. They start to irrigate their turf very early in the spring. Similar to when we're fertilizing, we don't need to really start irrigating until our turf grass is actively growing. And then once we do begin irrigation, we want to make sure that we're being conservative, both to protect our turf and also to protect our water resources here in Texas. And so, you can base your watering requirements around evapotranspiration rates. The Texas ET Network is a great resource to help you figure out exactly what that looks like. Also, as kind of a general rule of thumb, most of the warm season turf grasses, they don't need more than about an inch of water per week during the most active parts of the growing season, which fall between about May and September. And that should be adjusted based on rainfall. So if we get a lot of rainfall, you need to scale it back, right? So if we overwater, we're going to increase the likelihood of disease. If we water too early in the season, we're increasing the likelihood of disease. So those are all important things for us to think about as it relates to disease. The other thing for us to think about, another disease that we'll start to see symptoms of usually in the spring and early summer is going to be take-all root rot. So that's our other big lawn disease, and that's caused by a pathogen called Gommonomyces. Take-all root rot, still something that there's a lot of research around, but I think what we have found a lot of times is that this disease can be very opportunistic. So anytime our turf grass health is compromised or our root health is compromised, whether it's from extreme weather conditions, soil compaction, alkaline soils, fluctuations in water availability, whatever it is that's imposing stress on our turf, it increases the likelihood that this disease is going to become an issue. This pathogen is part of the natural soil ecology, so it's pretty much always there in the soil, and it's just looking for an opportunity to flourish. So we may start to see symptoms of that in the spring and early summer. Symptoms of take-all root rot, a lot of times first thing that we might see is a chlorosis or like a mottled yellowing across the lawn. It can look very similar to iron deficiency in turf. So one of the first things you might do is a soil test and just try to assess what's going on with your soil. One of the reasons we see that is, the disease is attacking the roots. That's affecting nutrient uptake. So that's going to lead to symptoms that resemble nutrient deficiency. Next thing that we'll start to see are these areas that begin to thin out. And these irregular shaped patches in the turf. They're not going to have the same neat rounded edges as our large patch disease. They're going to have a more irregular shape to them. When we dig into that turf, we'll see that the roots may take on a brown or blackened or kind of rotten appearance. They'll look sort of underdeveloped. We'll go up to the runners on our turf. St. Augustine is one that can be very prone to this disease, and we would be able to pull that runner or stolon right up from the soil with very few roots on it. The nodes on those stolons or runners may become discolored or brown. So those are symptoms that we want to look for. With that particular disease, a lot of times we recommend preventative fungicides in the spring and the fall. And a lot of times that timing lines up very well with when we're putting out our pre-emergent herbicides. So we can kind of think about doing those things around the same time. Again, you can also submit samples if you're ever worried to the disease diagnostic lab, and they can help to confirm that is or is not the primary culprit for what you're seeing. Take-all produces some very distinctive hyphae, fungal hyphae, that you can actually see with just a magnification lens a lot of times on your roots and your shoots of your plants. That's another thing that we're going to be looking for. And again, we just want to take a lot of steps early in the season not to overdo it, not to overdo our inputs, not to create unnecessary stress or strain on our turf, to ensure that our turf can come in, be healthy, well established.